Yes, class, I want to welcome you back for the second lesson. And I said the other time that we are going to continue with the causes of the French Revolution. So we are on the fourth cause. Our fourth causes, among the causes, the fourth one says the personal weaknesses of the king. Under this cause, we are saying that the king was weak and he could not handle bad situations. The king had good intentions and sometimes good policies, but could not implement them. He was a king by name and in power, but not in character. He had failed to make his own decisions and was always influenced by the nobles and the clergy. The king was interested in luxurious life and hunting in royal gardens than attending to the state problems. He mindedly interested in reforms, more interested in kingship, but most interested in hunting. King Louis failed to control the estate general meeting, which sparked off the French Revolution. When he failed to dictate on the sitting and voting arrangement and was overpowered by the Third Estate to begin the revolution. So under this factor, we are seeing a king being very weak to understand that he could not have his own policies. The king had people to decide for him instead of having his own decisions to make. And because of that, he was influenced by his subjects, for example, the nobles and the clergy. And it was this that made him to become a weak king. He was more interested in hunting in the royal gardens instead of attending to the state problems. So with this, really, the king was weak. Even when the Third Estate general meeting was sparked of a revolution, the king failed to do away with them. And it was because of these weaknesses that they had to take this opportunity to start a revolution which came in 1789. Under his weaknesses also is that he was a dictator, as it was reflected in the issuing of the letter de cachet, which meant imprisoning people without trial, which made French men react through a revolution. He was weak and relied on the poor advice, which created a revolutionary situation in France. He was advised by his wife Marie Antoinette to dismiss Turgot and Necker, something that annoyed the Frenchmen. As it was quoted, the king is too weak-minded to be stable, while the queen is too strong-minded to be sensible. The king was too weak in that when the estate general meeting broke off and declared themselves the national assembly, the king could not deploy forces to suppress them. He also involved France in the American War of Independence and intended to revenge against Britain, but after the war, the ideas of democracy were imparted back to France, hence inciting the Frenchmen into a revolution. So class, still on the weaknesses of the king, he was extravagant as he used to organize luxurious parties in his palace, which spent a lot of finances. For example, he used to buy 4 pairs of shoes per week for his wife and maintained 500 servants. This contributed to the financial crisis, hence leading to the revolution. He also passed a military law in 1781, which restricted the promotion to high ranks to the nobles. This annoyed the peasants, resulting into a revolution. The king signed the Cobden Treaty with Britain, which allowed taxed Britain goods to enter France and compete with French goods. This led to unemployment as French industries were collapsed, hence a revolution. So looking at all of those weaknesses, we can get to realize that the king was weak, and it was his weaknesses, coupled with the other factors, that led to the outbreak of the 1789 revolution in France. However, I encourage you to state the point, and our point is the weaknesses of the king. Bring out those weaknesses. You can even use commas. For example, he failing to make his decisions, being misadvised by his wife and the nobles and the clergy, being interested in hunting than working on state issues, being extravagant, for example, organizing luxurious parties while wasting a lot of finances instead of attending the state problems, signing treaties which made British goods to be outcompeted. French goods to be outcompeted by the British goods. All of these factors were weaknesses that led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. Another cause was the influence of the French philosophers. They were responsible for awakening the French people intellectually, these philosophers. For example, among the known ones were Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. They criticized the old order of the state and the Catholic Church, and they launched bitter attacks against the Catholic Church, and they condemned religious intolerance. And this was led by Voltaire, portraying the intolerances of the church and the church influencing the state issues, something that caused the open-mindedness to the French people to realize that their freedoms were being shined. He also denounced laws in France which emphasized the operation of Catholicism as a state religion. And in his famous publication, Letters in English, he praised religious freedom in Britain. He was a man who fought injustice but not preach a revolution. And he wanted reforms but not interested in the replacement of the monarchy. As he quoted to have said, "I had rather be ruled by one lion than 100 rats." His writings had effects on the millions of the French people, which made them to react into a revolution. Also, the philosophers developed the ideas of democracy. Also, the philosophers developed the idea of democracy. For example, Rousseau in his book, The Social Contract, suggested of a participatory democracy. This made the French masses demand for democracy from the French government. He preached for peace and liberty and condemned absolutism. And he is quoted to have remarked, "Man was born free, but everywhere he finds himself bounded into chains." The above made the French masses to reject the dictatorial regime of King Louis XVI. Also, they advocated for a constitutional monarchy, especially Montesquieu and Rousseau. This made the Frenchmen to demand for a constitution from the ancient regime, and failure made the revolution to occur. They reminded the Frenchmen of their freedom and incited people to demand for freedom. For example, Voltaire in his writing advocated for equality of all people before the law. Failure for the government to implement all of these reforms resulted into a revolution. Voltaire is the one who reminded people of their freedom. For example, he believed that since we were all born therefore we deserve equal rights, and we are all children of God, therefore we deserve equal treatment. And when the French people read about this, it made them to begin demanding for their freedom, because the king had oppressed them. He had arrested them. The king had killed most of them. So it was this that made the people of France to reject the poor leadership of the king and demand for another reform, something that ended up into the outbreak of the French Revolution. They also suggested some political reforms that the French government failed to put in place, forcing a revolution. For example, Montesquieu suggested the separation of power between the executive, legislature, and judiciary. When the French government refused to grant those reforms, the French masses reacted into a revolution. So, the philosophers also, we are seeing them suggesting for reforms. Another point, under the philosophers, they reminded the peasants and the middle class of their burdens when they criticized the unfair taxation system. The clergy and the nobles who had the capacity were exempted. Therefore, the revolution was therefore a reaction of the peasants to unfair taxation. They also developed a revolutionary idea of equality, liberty, and fraternity by advocating for fundamental freedom and equality of all classes before the law, which made people to begin demanding for their freedom. And the failure of the king to grant these freedoms is what led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. So class, I want to pose this question to you, a guiding question. For example, to what extent were the French philosophers responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789? Remember the following. I encourage you to introduce the French Revolution. I encourage you to give the stand, for example, either to a larger or a smaller extent. And tell us how these philosophers led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. Then again, on the other side of the coin, I encourage you also to show us how other factors led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. Then you make your conclusion basing on the way you understood the question. So class, with that, I beg us to go to another factor that led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. And this was the role of the encyclopedists. And we said that these were the people who simplified and summarized the work of philosophers in the books known as the encyclopedia, from where the Frenchmen extracted ideas to mobilize the revolution. Because the writings of the philosophers were not easily understood by the French masses, not until the encyclopedists simplified them, which awakened the masses, resulting into a revolution. So With the encyclopedists, what they did was they just summarized, they simplified the works of the political philosophers in their books called encyclopedia. And it was this that became very easy for the French masses whose freedoms were violated by the kings to be understood, which later made them to realize that really the king had misguided or misruled them for so long. And it was this that made them reject the leadership of the king and start the revolution. I beg to end there, and I want to thank you so much for your time and have a blessed day.